Hey everybody, I'm Marcus Hazelwood, and welcome to Clear Haze Exchange. I'm an energy engineer with over 15 years of experience in sustainability and energy efficiency consulting. Many find these topics a little complex, so I created Clear Haze Exchange to help provide clear, actionable insight. Clearing the haze, so to speak. We'll cover plenty of topics under the umbrella of energy efficiency and sustainability. Let's get into today's conversation. Welcome, listeners, to season 2 of Clear Haze Exchange, focusing on the hidden systems behind sustainable investment decisions. Today's guest I'm really excited about is Chris Halpin. Chris is president of Celtic Energy, PLLC, and a nationally recognized leader in energy savings performance contracting, ESPCs, energy project finance, and resilient strategy. With more than 40 years in the industry, Chris has served as owner's representative on over $2.5 billion in energy projects across federal, state, and private sectors. He's worked extensively with the U.S. military, Department of Energy, GSA, and major institutions helping organizations structure performance-based energy investments that align technical rigor with financial accountability. Chris, welcome to the show.
All right. Marcus, thank you. I really appreciate you having me on. It's my first
Yeah,
podcast.
absolutely. We were just talking before we started about the World Cup, and
Yeah.
I just found out we're both left-footed strikers.
Yes.
I love that.
Yes.
I'm a absolute soccer fan, and I'm going to play as long as I can. And I heard that you're the same way, that you
Same
played as
way.
long as you could, and
As long as I possibly could. And growing up, my two brothers were defenders, and I'm the oldest. Of course, you always want to try to get your older brother back, right? So they turned out to be great defenders, right? Because they're trying to chase me around all the time, and I'm trying to score goals on them. So it was fun. Good
I
upbringing.
love it.
Yeah.
So, you and I worked together at NV5 when NV5 acquired your company. And so, tell us a little bit about your background and where we initially met.
Sure. I'd owned my company, Celtic Energy Inc., incorporated based when I was still living in Connecticut for almost 20 years, 18-ish years. And then I was approached by NV5, looked like a good fit. And my wife and I were moving out west here to Las Vegas anyway. So the timing was right. And we did the acquisition January of 19. Started working for NV5 for 3 years. I worked full time as a vice president for NV5, and it worked really well. I have to say, not all acquisitions go that great. This one worked out really positively, and I got to know lots of other people at NV5, which at that time was still mainly a U.S. based firm with a few outposts internationally. Now it's a massive firm with I don't know 6 or 7 thousand people now that they've merged with Accurate. And I think you and I started working together right before the pandemic, I believe. All right, 2019, 20, when I think you had just moved to Ohio. I can't recall now, but we were trying to train up the rest of NV5 on energy savings performance contracting and how you could take your clients that you guys were designing chiller plants and just getting that one fee instead of working with us and have them do a complete building wide or portfolio wide upgrade that's financed. You all would get a much bigger fee over a much longer period of time with our sort of input, right? Our specialty of performance contracting. So that worked pretty well. Everyone likes to stay in their lanes, as you know, in big corporations, but we were able to chip away at little things here and there inside MV5. But it was very good experience, and we really enjoyed working with you and others in the MEP team and really teaching everybody a little bit more about how this thing called energy savings performance contracting, which has been around for 50 plus years, yet it's
Yeah.
still mostly unknown, is an unbelievable delivery option, especially for public agencies and nonprofits.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say add when you came on board and I was able to kind of work and understand a little bit more about what you guys were doing, it really excited me because I had heard of ESPCs prior, but really getting involved helps you understand deeper, especially on the side of working with projects seeing the oversight that you were doing and making sure the projects happen. It was really exciting to start learning more about it at that time for me.
Cool. Yeah, it was great. And one of my favorite things about all of this, now that I've been at this for so long, is really teaching young people about this. Right? Because it's for me, for any public agency or nonprofit, it is the best tool they have in their tool bag to get a lot done. Right? And again, I could spend the whole hour just talking about that, but it allows them to get very comprehensive retrofits done and new construction, right? I've done this for new schools, new office buildings, and use it to be able to increase the efficiency of these buildings and pay for it over a long period of time, which is one of the real differences.
Good. So after 4 decades or so in energy project delivery, what would you say most organizations misunderstand about ESPCs?
Well, unfortunately, there's still quite a few myths and misunderstandings out there. There's a whole myriad of them, but some of the top ones I hear is you talk to like superintendent of a school district and he's like, yeah, so I understand I can borrow money from these ESCOs, these energy services companies, and then I pay them back. I'm like, no, 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 no. These ESCOs, energy services companies, are basically construction companies, highly specialized GCs, say, right? And a lot of them are owned by these big manufacturers like, Siemens, Schneider, Carrier, Trane, a lot of big air conditioning companies and controls companies own these, but they're in the business of building things and getting paid up front, right? During construction, just like you would do with a big, Whiting Turner construction company. So you borrow money from a third party, like a bank. There's, hundreds of banks that do this, specialty lenders and all that. So the mush market, the municipal, university, school, hospital market is almost all three-party agreements where you hire your ESCO to develop and build a project, and you hire a bank or a lender to basically loan you the money. All right. It's just like if you buy a new house, the owner doesn't loan you the money, right? You go to your bank and you get a loan, you get a mortgage. It's much like that with performance contracting. So trying to get over that initial misunderstanding is usually a big step, because if it was like that, like you probably have heard of energy as a service, right? It's like a much more complex version of performance contracting where the ESCO does bring the money. They usually have a financial partner embedded in the deal, much like the federal marketplace works like that. And you're paying a lot more money for that because it's like a commercial loan versus a tax exempt loan. And that's the difference between like a 5% interest rate and a 7% interest rate. So we try to make that clear to people at the beginning. That's probably one of the biggest misunderstandings. Another one is, oh, I've heard about this. It's so expensive. I see these 25, 30% markup. We're not going to do that. We'll just either do it ourselves with the shops, right? Mechanical shops, electrical. We'll just do it as we get money, or we'll do our normal, design, bid, build. And neither work very well, right? These days, ever since the pandemic, right? It was already bad in public infrastructure. The pandemic sort of pulled the Band-Aid off, like how bad HVAC was in this country, especially in schools, but everywhere it's that way. And the shops just never have the time or the money or the training to do what needs to get done, to really do deep retrofits. And design bid build is just a very old model of doing this, where you have a lot of conflicts of interest, where your architects and engineers get hired. Their job is to use the little fee that they get to put out a design that meets code, and that's it. And the contractors basically are in it to basically put in a low price because it's always low bid, and then they change order the owners to death, which is a terrible thing to do. And I did this in the 80s when I first started in the energy business. We were one of these consulting firms that did the audit, then we did the design, put it out to bid on the owner's behalf, and just got clobbered by the contracting community. So performance contracting, it's design build, right? There's one entity in charge of all of that. So for me, I've argued this for many years, and actually Department of Energy did studies on this and showed that if you try to do it yourself, it will take longer because you don't get the money, right? It'll take you 5 to 7 years to finally get the money to do, say, a $10 million project versus borrowing that 10 million at once. It's the same reason why people don't buy houses with cash unless they're rich, or cars. They get loans, right? And I try to get that into people's heads to help them understand it from their personal lives, right?
Yeah.
Because then they go,
Yeah.
oh, of course, I'm buying a $750,000 house. I don't have that kind of money laying around.
Yeah.
What am I going to do?
Yeah.
Cash in my IRA? No, you're gonna get a loan.
So with that said, so many people will hear performance contract and they'll also think free energy
Yeah.
upgrades. So what does that narrative oversimplify the
Yeah.
reality?
Yeah. So, like I said before, the performance contracting. It sounds kind of fancy, right? Energy savings performance contracting. It's like, what does that mean? And I find that I was explaining this to a friend of mine this morning at the gym because I told her I'm doing this podcast, and she's like, "So what do you really do actually?" And I could see him explaining it to her, and it's like over the head, right? And she's a recruiter, right? So this is just no business in this kind of thing. But what I see is the beauty and the utility of performance contracting, and it's in the name, right? Most contracting is the owner has to somehow figure out what they want done, and they have to somehow convey that clearly enough to the contracting community so that they get bids. If they're a public agency, they have to put it out to bid some way, somehow. Depends on what their bidding requirements, procurement requirements are. You have to put it out in a way so that you get hopefully fair and reasonable pricing, and hopefully the contractors have really understand what people so-called blueprints, right? The design and specifications. And unfortunately, over the past 30, 40 years since I've been in this business, the fees that have been getting paid to the design community have been going down, right? The pressure of everything like that, just like in doctors and unfortunately lawyers, not the same, but it's forcing down the fees for the professional community. And that reduces the quality of the design documents, right? And so when the bids come in, they come in as low as possible to get the job. And like I mentioned earlier, they just keep putting on the cost. So with performance contracting, you solicit a partner. I say we pick a partner, not a project. So you put out a request for proposal, request for qualifications that is basically qualifications oriented with some indicative pricing. So like if you got the job, what would you charge us, percent of construction costs for commissioning, training, design, da 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 da. So no one's trying to guess at an absolute number, a 5 million, a 10 million, $15 million number. That alone has made such a difference in this business, right? It's really just design, build, construction. That's what performance contracting is. That has these performance and financial metrics embedded into the contract. And that's for me is the difference. And it is a complex procurement strategy, really. At the end of it, it takes me usually several months sitting in front of the owners before we ever put out, when I would do this full time as an owner's rep, before we'd ever think about putting out an RFP on the street, we would spend 3 to 6 months educating everyone from, if it's the school system, the superintendent, all the way down to the custodial staff, right? If it's a huge organization, like I've worked on massive military bases, right? Huge here in the US as well as overseas, and developing like almost $500 million in some of these cases, but 250 to $350 million projects on 400 buildings. So we had to get everyone, but the Air Force, like from the wing commander down to all of the different engineering groups, facilities groups, maintenance groups, the finance, budget, procurement, everybody, get them on board so they understand what's going to be expected of them before you ever put this out. Because it is definitely different than what most public entities ever do. And if you do one of these, it's usually once during your career, right? So it's not like buying laptops, right? Buying smart boards. People do that all day long, right? Getting, new special ed teachers, that's been getting done for decades and decades, right? So it's a bit different, but it's something that is performance oriented with a lot of rules that makes it much more beneficial to the owner.
Yeah, I love the way that you educate people before getting into it,
Yes.
because it is very important that everyone understand what their involvement is versus saying, "Oh, they're coming in and doing upgrades." It can't be a one-way street. Not only in ESPCs, but in the design world, it's a struggle sometimes getting everyone to understand the responsibilities involved, especially when it comes to energy efficiency and sustainability goals.
Yep. And I don't know how much you've covered in the background of ESPC and these podcasts previously, but for me, education is absolutely the key to success in all of this, right? And that includes, educating the ESCOs, right? Who, these days tend to be sales forward, right? Where they used to be more engineering forward. When I was doing this in the 90s, I worked for an ESCO and we had a bunch of engineers like me going around selling these deals, right? And these days, it's like the rest of American corporate business. It's profit driven, and performance doesn't always come to the forefront, right? And there's a lot of good companies that do this, and they put their best foot forward. But sometimes there's a lack of education on the contracting side as well as on the owner side. So that's one of the reasons when I was doing this for Department of Energy the past 2 years through this ESPC campaign, we're putting on webinars for everybody so that they could really learn these best practices that we had been putting together for years and years. And the more education everyone receives, the better the customer they are on the owner side, right? And the better they are at providing those services, you know, like other things like electric vehicles, right? They're brand new for a lot of people and they're scared of them until they learn about them. And then they're like, oh, wow, now that I know more about this, I'm willing to spend the money to buy the EV.
So that kind of leads into my next question around risk. So thinking about that education and the value of that piece, what risks are transferred and what remain with the owner in terms of getting into a performance contract like this? So could you kind of speak on the risk
Sure,
involved?
sure. So with performance contracting, the traditional setup of this is the energy services companies, who, like I said earlier, tend to be larger corporations with a pretty good sized balance sheet, right? And that balance sheet allows them to take the carrying costs that's required to work for a year or 2 years without getting paid, right? Because that's what really happens with this, right? So typically they start out, they get selected through a procurement, they sign an investment grade audit agreement. Then it can take 6 months to a year, sometimes more, depending on the approval process and all that. And that's all done basically on spec, right? They're going to spend $200,000 to $1 million sometimes doing this energy audit. And if the owner decides not to go forward, they get paid their fee and everyone walks away. And ESCOs aren't in the business of doing energy audits. They're in the business of building things and getting the markups and the fees and all that. So the risk transfer here is basically taking from the owner's side, who these days, like I mentioned earlier, ever since for the Great Recession, 12, 15 years ago, and then the pandemic, especially in the public markets, there has not been the investment back into facilities and staff that there once were, that was carried by taxes. And they have not been able to take care of all this equipment, right? It's terrible, but that's just the way it is. Even new buildings, brand new schools, and they just don't work and all this. So the risk there is for non-performance, and like we've had here in Las Vegas, last year 12 schools had to close down because the air conditioning went off. You have to send everybody home because it was 110 degrees, right? Kids can't stay in the school. So taking that risk and transferring it over to the ESCO is one of the best things a public entity can do. However, it has to be done in a fair manner, and it has to be written out. The roles and responsibilities, expectations, penalties, all that needs to be written out in a very comprehensive contract, right? And again, that's where we would come in as an owner's rep. We really got hired as a risk management agent. A lot of people think of what we would do as like you're like the math double checker. That's a small part of what we do. Yes, we're looking at the lighting spreadsheets and the energy simulation models and making sure, yeah, that looks like you've modeled that building pretty well and the baseline looks good and the savings should come in at about what you think. What's even more important than that is helping identify the risk, allocate the risk, manage the risk, right? And that's what owners reps are really there for. And again, I spend a lot of time talking about this in this ESPC campaign, which if you want, I'll send you the link to it. And you can go look at all of the webinars and trainings that we did. But that really helps not only initially in the setup and you get a good solid procurement, but I saw one of your questions was to reduce long-term friction, right? If you set it up properly from the beginning and the ESCO's on board, the owner's rep is on board, all sort of rowing in the same direction, these things sail, right? I've ones that go well, I have never seen the cities and towns and school districts so happy about a project as I've seen with these, right? Because it's collaborative and it's not adversarial like in a lot of construction projects, and there's no suing at the end and all that. That's very, very rare.
Yeah, and that's a good point. So that kind of is what separates good ESPC contracts
Yes,
from the ones that create long-term friction. So with that being said, some organizations do hesitate to pursue ESPCs even when the opportunity is strong. And is it because of those risks and understanding the structure and the need for an owner's rep? So could you speak to why some organizations are hesitant?
sure, sure. And there's a lot of that out there. But there was one other thing I wanted to mention before I forget about it with the well-structured projects and risk transfer. The other risk transfer is price risk, as we're all living in real time right now since this Iran war started. First, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, natural gas prices jumped by 30% like overnight, and electric bills in many places in the US, like here in Las Vegas, the school system here, so a 30% increase in their electric costs because of natural gas, right? Because that's, usually 6 months in arrears. So that's going to continue to happen here. No matter what happens with the ceasefire and all that, this is going to be 2 to 3 years of effects on not just energy prices of everything that includes fuel. So what ends up happening is if you put in a performance contract that reduces your cost, your literal outlay every budget year by 20 to 30%, that's about what these result in, right? You can get up to 40 or 50% if you do a really super deep retrofit. You think about that, that's that much more money that does not have to go into that budget, right? And it reduces footprint. I like to think of it. I used to do these things for the Department of Energy Better Building Initiative, and my first screen showed B-2 bombers, right? Stealth aircraft, most advanced stealth aircraft in the world, and their radar signature is the size of a seagull, right? And there's these huge jets carrying 1,000-pound bombs. That's what I try to do for my clients' buildings, right? You try to get your energy signature as small as possible. It reduces your risk, right? And that worked for virtually everything, and from your supply chain, energy supply chain, and other supply chains, all the way through to maintenance and management and all of that. So the price risk transfer is huge here. By doing one of these projects, you create a huge risk management tool. Just like the airlines, Southwest Airlines was famous for this years ago. They were the best price hedging fuel airline out there, right? That's one of the reasons they were so profitable. They were the best of all the airlines at hedging the fuel costs. And that's what you're doing with your buildings by putting in a performance contract, especially if you can put in really sophisticated controls that can do demand response, right? That's what's causing grid costs to go up so much today, these peaks. There's like 12 hours of a peak here in Las Vegas, 12 hours in the summer. If that could be controlled, it would reduce utility costs by 25%. So that's the power of risk transfer on the price side, as well as the construction and performance risk side. So anyway, enough of that
No,
one.
that's good because people are trying to, so people want to see that face value. It's almost like, with a design and construction project, they're seeing, oh, how much does this cost? And how much can we reduce it? Who has the lowest cost just so that we can get this built? But that long-term operational cost, you have this building for 15, 20, 30, 40, 50
Yes,
plus years, that is ongoing cost, whether it's demand costs, increased utility rates. You're right, it's a much larger investment on the long term than that upfront. And so would you say that's part of the challenges is owners not seeing that long-term impact, those long-term savings over that upfront?
that's exactly it, right? So in this country today, total cost of ownership is not a thing, right? It's all quarterly, dividend driven or EPS driven strategies, right? It goes from corporate C suites down through the whole economy, right? And even in schools, right? A lot of, superintendents who'd be in schools for 20, 30 years. That's a thing of the past, right? It's 2 years, 3 years. It's becoming like corporate CEOs. And it's all about test scores and this and that, right? And so what can be done with this is the ability to affect whatever your mission is, whether it's teaching, healing the sick, right? Processing whatever it is, military, Coast Guard, no matter what you're doing, you can improve your mission by reducing the risks of the infrastructure you have that contain your mission, right? I heard it put best by the former director of facilities for the Air Force. He said, energy assurance is mission assurance, right? And I was like, wow, what a great tagline, because you could use that for everything. And we're seeing it today, right? With climate change, I call it global weirding, right? Because it's really cold in some spots, and people point to go, oh, look, it's 20 degrees colder. Well, that's a polar vortex caused by the instability in the atmosphere caused by, climate change. So it's different. It's the lack of attention to what goes on over a long period of time. No one sees benefits in 15 years where everything is still working, right? That's the thing. And it's only when you can educate the staff and the decision makers that this makes so much sense for us, right? It's sort of like when a city or a town puts out a referendum to build a new school or do the renovation of the schools, or we really need to upgrade our water treatment plant or a wastewater treatment plant, right? Sometimes they get shut down because people just see their taxes going up. They don't think about the fact that's what I was leading to, the ravages of these climate change, right? It's destroying our infrastructure in real time in front of us, right? And the resilience part of performance contracting, for me, saving money, wonderful, right? It's all nice. But resilience is, for me, where it's at today. If you can protect your infrastructure from here, it's overheating. Where you are, it's flooding, right? And on the East Coast, it's sea level rise and flooding and hurricanes and storm surge, right? And there's very few things public agencies especially can do to address this in a short period of time. But boy, if you could do a performance contract that replaces your 30-year-old heating and air conditioning systems, gets your transformers out of the basement and puts them on the second floor, like we saw after Superstorm Sandy in New York, right? And either you learned that lesson or you didn't, right? And the ones that didn't pay a very large price. But being able to address these long-term things, there's virtually nowhere else in public infrastructure procurement strategies that allows that. When I try to explain this to people, like how can they relate to it personally? I'm like, okay, so say you're going to build a new house, right? Whether you're single or it's a couple or whatever, oh my God, we're going to have this mortgage. It's going to be $3,000 a month. And I really would like to get, maybe they both like to cook. We're going to get the gourmet kitchen, spend the extra $40,000, $50,000. All right, you know what? This is worth it to us. It's going to be an extra $100 a month. Okay, we can deal with that. Or putting in a really good security system, right? Or really good fencing, whatever it is. They're like, you know what? This is going to be worth it for us. And it's only a little bit more per month. That people can justify, right? If it was cash out of your pocket, oh, I don't have an extra 50 grand, right? Performance contracting is a lot like that because the financing, most of these are done in a 15 to 25-year term, right? 15 to 18 years is a sweet spot from a financial point of view, an ROI point of view. But I've seen university clients of mine, we're doing 18 years because it allows us to put in the really high quality controls. It allows us to spend the extra money to sort of future proof the building, right? And again, raise things up out of the floodplain, right? Or even what used to be a 100-year floodplain, it happens every 2 or 3 years now, right? So there's a lot of things like that. And I'm getting off the subject here, but it's very important for me that people understand the resilience benefits of performance contracting. On top of the financial risk management, all that, this is immensely useful tool for that.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the federal opportunity and the public sector leverage, because a lot of the infrastructure we see is federal infrastructure, and then there's public infrastructure in addition to the commercial world. But federal agencies and public institutions have used these ESPCs for
Yes.
decades, of course. Why has the federal sector been such fertile ground for that? Is it because they're the ones, like you mentioned, DOE, pushing this and understanding how it works better? Is it because they're more educated? Is there just more opportunity? Why would you say that the federal sector has been such a fertile ground for ESPCs?
I was thinking about this this morning, and what really occurred to me is it's not the things you would think, right? Um, yeah, federal buildings, there's lots of federal buildings. Most ordinary people don't interact with federal buildings unless they have to go to the Social Security office or they're in federal prison, right? Or federal courthouse, whatever. You don't really deal, right? Or you're a former, serviceman or woman and you go to the VA. Other than that, you don't really interact in federal facilities. But you do with schools, you do with town halls, you do with the libraries, fire stations, police stations, right? All these community buildings. And the federal government is monolithic, right? From a contractual point of view and procurement point of view, there is one single set of rules, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, or the FARs, they're called. So any federal agency, no matter who they are, they can be Air Force Base in Kodiak, Alaska, right, to a VA in Atlanta, to the federal courthouse in New York City, right? They all follow the exact same set of rules to procure anything, including performance contracting. And in the Energy Policy Act of 1992, Clinton and Congress at the time passed this EPAC 92, where it did a lot of things for upgrading federal buildings with codes and all this stuff. It also put the enabling legislation in place for what they call super ESPC, super energy savings performance contracting. So what that did was put a set of laws and policies in place that overrode or superseded the FARs. It's the only thing in this whole country that does that. Right? It's huge, right? And most people don't know about this, but so every other agency, whether you're the Air Force buying space weapons, right, or whatever it is, you have to follow the FARs. Only performance contracting is exempt from that. So it then allows Air Force, Army, whoever it is, USGS, to go and hire an ESCO, an energy services company, under this design build formula, right? And then do the 25-year contract. Otherwise, you can't sign contract for 25 years in the federal government. So for me, that is like the single biggest thing, right? You also have procurement of utilities at a very large scale, right? DLA, Defense Logistics Agency, was a client of mine for many years. It's still NV5's client. And they're the largest purchaser of energy in the world, right? Globally. They buy all the jet fuel for every Air Force base, all the diesel, all the uranium for the Navy, everything, right? Everything that goes into cars, trucks, tanks, planes, you name it, all the military bases, all bought by DLA. So they have a program where they can basically run their own individual performance contracting program because they have this monolithic platform they can use. Once you get outside of that, right, to the state and local government market, number one, it's very hard for them to make anybody do anything, right? The federal government can say a new executive order, right? We just saw it a year ago. All these executive orders, get rid of wind, get rid of solar, and you don't have that in states and local governments. It's almost impossible to do that, right? So it makes it much more difficult because of the disaggregation of the rules. Schools especially, right? There's over 100,000 schools in this country that make up the largest single set of infrastructure we have, building infrastructure in this country, and use more energy than anything else, right? But they're also locally controlled down to little tiny towns. When I lived in Connecticut, there were towns of like 3,000 people had their own school system, right? Their own superintendent, own maintenance, all that. So it makes it much more difficult to procure and manage and oversee and all that on a local basis than it does at the federal level. And so that's probably the biggest difference why, but what it's done, it's created this whole industry. Like performance contracting really started in Ohio, actually, and the state of Washington in the early 80s. And the company I worked for in Boston, that's where they did a lot of the original work, Hospital Efficiency Corporation. And so they started doing things, but again, on a sort of a ad hoc basis until the U.S. Department of Energy said, that's it. We're setting up this whole monolithic program And I was lucky enough to be involved in a lot of the guidance development that was done. You have these like 3-day retreats and sit around with all the laboratories and ESCOs and put together guidance documentation. So they've created this whole infrastructure that state and local governments are now pulled from to be able to improve their own performance contracting programs. So it's been great from an example, not all of which you can follow because states can't print money, right? Like the federal government could do. And not everyone can sign a 25-year contract like the federal government does.
So, what would you say is an early stage signal that an organization is ready for an ESPC given that climate that you explained?
So if your utility bills have been increasing, that's a sign, because what ends up happening, as we all know, budgets are tight. They've been tight since 2010, right? It's 2008, 10, where, nothing ever really recovered in this country since the Great Recession. And everyone wants to keep taxes low, right? So in the public infrastructure, right, everything is literally run till it dies, more or less. So the military is even more so. So when things start to break down, more than normal, oh, well, that one chiller went down, we always have to fix that. When it starts to become endemic, it's time, right? Or your bills have been increasing 5% per year and your budget just can't keep up with it, right? And everyone has to pay their utility bills or they get shut off, right? So it's not like other things. You can just there's always arguments with teacher unions and fire department and all that, and that takes years to go. But with the utility, you got to pay your bills, right? And that's one of the beauties of the way performance contracting is set up. The money that gets saved out of the utility streams, that's the part that gets monetized. That gets set aside or fenced, and that's what gets used to pay back the loan over the 15 or 20 years. Because the financiers know you're going to pay your utility bills, and they know you're going to pay them back, right? So that's the two signs for me. Things start to break and they get beyond the ability of your staff to handle it. And the prices just keep increasing. Right now, it's like we really need to do something. And then the way I talked about earlier with trying to do it yourself, a regular design bid build, it's been proven. It just does not work very well. It's more expensive and takes longer, and you don't have any guarantees. Right? The ESCOs are guaranteeing the performance of the equipment, and it's fixed prices. There's no change orders in performance contracting. And the way you run them properly, like the way we used to do, you get open book pricing that you just don't get normally in public procurement.
Good. With this season, we're talking about some of the hidden systems, the things that people don't see, owners don't see. And I think one of them, which I've been involved with, is measurement and verification. And it's often treated as a technical detail, like you mentioned in design build projects, but it's not often looked at as the value that it actually brings. So why is it actually a central trust to have some level of measurement and verification?
Great question. And it's an overlooked detail. And I like the way you expressed it here. It's a technical detail. It is highly technical, right? I mean, there's parts of this, depending on what you're doing, that involve like linear regression analysis, which I never understood. That's why I had employees who used to do that for me. But for me, it really is sort of like trust but verify sort of issue. It's something that people are much more used to commissioning these days, right? M&V today, and even like using owner's reps, is in the same position where commissioning was in the mid 90s, right? Where commissioning back then to most building owners were like, what would I do that for? My contractor's going to do it the way my architect tells him to. No, they're not. Believe me, most of my family are in construction in New York. It doesn't happen that way, right? And they do what they want to do and get away with what they can. And there's no rules around it, right? It's really hard to keep people from doing that. So M&V, like commissioning, basically embeds performance metrics into the deal from the beginning, right? Just like with commissioning, at the very beginning, the contractor has to tell you the commissioning approach, right? If we build this building this way, here's how it's going to get commissioned. Before a single hammer hits a nail, right? Everyone knows what's going to happen. And then you are going to have the activities, and you're going to have people from the owner side there, the guys and gals in the blue, overalls, witnessing these commissioning activities. right? And then they're going to be reading the commissioning reports afterwards to say, yeah, this air conditioning unit, we ran it through its paces, and when it went down to, went off at 80 degrees on Saturday when no one's there, and it came back to 75 on Monday morning when everyone's there. Great. That's commissioning. And that's the way M&V gets treated, right? Measurement and verification is not only, well, let's make sure a year out after the stuff gets put in, we go and measure the electrical load. No, before anything gets done, part of M&V is what we call developing the baseline. You have to figure out how much energy are we using, where is it being used, how's it being used, how much are we spending on it. That's the energy baseline. There's also the operations and maintenance baseline. That gets lost to most people. How are we actually operating this equipment and maintaining it over time? That has a lot to do with how much energy you're using. Right? Like you've probably seen this too, in schools especially, and sometimes town buildings. There's that one volleyball game on that Saturday night in the winter, and we have to turn the heat back on, right? Or turn it, for like occupied mode. And the guy sits at his desk and he types it in, all right, we'll see you next week. And it never gets turned back. So every Saturday for 6 months, the heating has come on in that huge gym, right? And that's very typical. So measurement and verification, an approach like that although it's technical in nature, it creates a metric that provides trust between the parties, right? And again, that's another great role for an owner's rep. Most owners are not going to look at this and go, I already have to understand the state's Department of Education rules,
Yeah.
right? Or that's like GASB and FASB for financial people. That's really what M&V is. We say it's like the gospel of performance contracting. The ESCOs and the owners reps understand it in detail, and we teach the owners enough to know, and their staff especially, the folks who are doing the operations and maintenance, we always make sure we bring them at the very, very beginning, teach them about this stuff, because they're going to be the ones living with these buildings once the ESCO, leaves the site in a year or two.
Yeah. That's good. And thinking about that in a way of this is where poorly defined scopes kind of undermine the long term savings. And I think you would agree that the same thing applies. Understanding the impacts of this new design, this initial capital investment, whether it's a large capital investment up front or a smaller one, the long term ROI has to be sustained. And in many cases, that design build case, your architect 2, 3 years later, they're gone. Your contractor, your general contractor, they're gone. And your maintenance team is left holding the keys to making sure that an amazing design and new construction building is functioning. And if they're not brought in the beginning, it's harder on them. And you can't expect them to maintain if they haven't been properly educated or given direction, given the ability to see and understand what to expect. I think that's a very, very valuable point.
Mm,
And throughout even my career, I've seen it time and time again to where it gets lost. And I think that's really where the value of ESCOs comes in. And as
yes,
you explained, supports the longevity.
exactly. And one of the things that I noticed, right? So when I was doing this as the earlier on in my career with the design, bid, build stuff, and then primarily in schools, and then I did this for corporations, right? So when I moved to Boston in 1989, I worked for this company called Energy Investment. That was a great company, little boutique energy engineering firm, and we would do energy audits and designs right when utility demand side management started in the late 80s, right? They're like, well, we have to build these new power plants. Let's do efficiency instead, right? Or at least delay these power plants. So we were doing the energy audits and designs for IBM, Kraft, GM, GE, right? Big corporations all over the country. And we were like, the same thing's happening. Same thing that's happening we see in the public market is design bid build, it's low bid, even though corporations could just award it to somebody, they were being forced. This is when Jack Welch was just getting going, right, at GE and pushing the pricing down of everything. And I started to see after a while, talking to friends of mine who'd left and went to work for ESCOs, but like we actually build stuff and we control the whole thing. We do the audits, we do the design, and we build it. And we can sit down at the table, like on the same side of the table with the owners and collaboratively define the scope, right? It's like the owners know here's the fire, right? The fires that need to be put out, but we also have these long-term things. And the ESCOs are constantly learning about all the new technologies that are on the marketplace that the people on the public side, they just don't have the time for that, right? So you get to meld these two things, and some of the most fulfilling parts of my career after all these years have been sitting down with folks who care a lot about what they're doing, don't get the staffing, don't get the funding, and being able to pull in a partner like one of these, especially some of the top tier ESCOs with good values and working together. And I've been to like award ceremonies where these people are jumping up and down, like you saw when the Knicks won NBA. It was almost like that. I mean, people don't get excited about facilities, right? But because there's nothing sexy about it. But boy, to be able to do a project like this where finally the fire alarms have stopped going off, right? I literally seen this. We got a whole fire alarm system replaced because it kept going off. The fire department kept charging the school for this, and we used performance contracting to replace the fire alarm system, right? And all kinds of cool stuff like this. And it just made for a really good story for everybody because it helps the owners, using private industry and private money to do the public good. The true definition of public-private partnerships, right? And that's what this really is when you get down to it. I think that answer your
Yeah, it
question.
does. It does. And one of the examples came to mind is the typical kind of example of, okay, here's your Ferrari. You hand the owner the keys and say, "See you later." And if they don't know how to operate that
Right.
engine from a technical standpoint, where you're probably looking at the looks as the owner, as this thing looks good and it does has these great functions, but in terms of how to maintain it, I didn't go to school for engineering, cars, so I just wanna drive it. And that's how owners are thinking. It's not that they need to go to school, they need to be educated enough about the product, but they wanna be able to drive and focus on their business, what they're doing in their space. They're building their infrastructure, as you mentioned earlier, doing what it needs to continue to support what their goals and mission is.
Yes. That's actually a great point that goes back to the risk transfer. So well managed and well documented from a contractual point of view, right? And then in these performance contracts, there's multiple schedules and attachments, right? That are like, here's the operations and maintenance plan. Here's the commissioning plan. Here's the training plan. And that training plan includes, and we would require this, however many hours of classroom training, however many hours of on-site training, and everything is recorded. So when the new folks get hired in to the shops or wherever they are, there's going to be this training, sexual harassment training, that training, and there's going to be the performance contract training. So you really understand what your role and responsibility is as part of that. And we'll have the ESCOs come to refresher training, right? Because it works for everybody then. Once the owner's staff gets trained on this, and in some cases, like in the federal performance contracting world, the ESCOs have contractual responsibility for OMR&R, operations, maintenance, repair, and renovation. So in that case, it's more expensive to do it in the federal market because of that, but it's literally their responsibility. So if something goes wrong, the ESCO needs to run out there and get it done, right? And the mush market is not quite that comprehensive, but there's always a lot of training that gets, well, not always, under best practices driven projects, a lot of training happens. And in some cases, it allows the owner staff to upgrade their capabilities, get better tools. They get iPads. We worked on a project here in Nevada where the two main towns are a 4-hour drive apart. It's the second largest county in the United States, right? So if there was a problem in Tonopah, you had to drive from Pahrump in your pickup truck for 4 hours, right? And this ESCO came in, upgraded everything, all new controls, all new HVAC, a little bit of solar. And this is in a very, very red county, by the way, right? And so it was doing this sort of work in a very politically conservative environment, which is a beautiful thing for me. And the amount of time alone that it saved, that guy could sit at his laptop, right? He and his other guys got laptops now, instead of getting in his pickup truck and driving 4 hours only to find out that it was the fuse or whatever. He was able to diagnose everything remotely and got alerts on his phone. I mean, that's the power that this has done the right way.
Yeah. That leads me to a last question I had for you. What really gives you confidence that performance-based delivery models still have a strong future going forward?
So the world as we know it is changing, right? Right, AI and all that, all right? Even before that, like software as a service, all these things as a service, right? It's basically taking away the need for owners or whatever the infrastructure is to have to maintain all of it themselves, right? The whole phenomenon of outsourcing, right? That's been going on for 30 years, 40 years in this country. A lot of it started at universities with outsourcing the food, right? They send it to Sodexo, Marriott, or somebody, right? And that's been going everywhere, right? And we're seeing this with energy now too. It's like if your mission is to fight wars, what are you doing spending all this time with soldiers maintaining boilers?
Yeah,
You shouldn't be doing that, right?
yeah.
Um, so it's better to bring in specialists for these kinds of things, and that's where I see performance contracting is it's a highly specialized tool that's a public-private partnership, right? It's no matter what your politics, this is a fantastic tool because yes, it saves carbon, it's good for the environment, yay. But boy, it creates a lot of jobs and it reduces costs and it increases reliability, right? It brings a lot of local positive things to economies. And in rural areas, these things are godsends to rural areas, right? Because it finally fixes the schools that have been decrepit because all the kids are moving away, right? So for me, it's always been there, it will always be there, right? The last webinar I did for DOE a few months ago was all about, ESPC is still the best tool in your toolbox, right? And because it doesn't require a referendum, like especially for schools and cities and towns where they have to do, like I mentioned earlier, the upgrades to the schools or the water treatment plants or whatever, that's a political nightmare. You're taking money you're already handing to your utilities, your electric, your gas, your water, your sewer, and your contractors you're paying tens of thousands of dollars a year to maintain 30 and 40-year-old equipment. You get to take that money, you reinvest it, right? You monetize it, right? You take all the waste out of the system and you fence that money and you reinvest it in your own facilities, right? And from using specialists, highly trained specialists to help you do this, whether it's the owner's reps and the ESCOs and your financial advisors and your financial providers working all together seamlessly, right? Using model documents. I forgot to mention the model documents earlier. That's one of the traits of a really good performance contract. There's federal and there's state model documents you can use. And again, we can do a whole other webinar just on
Yeah,
that. But
absolutely.
that for me, just because that's the way society is going now anyway, all right? But by using outside specialists and outside money to solve problems. And that's exactly what this is at the heart of it.
Well, Chris, such a wealth of knowledge chatting with you. This has been an amazing conversation, at least for me and hopefully for the listeners as well. But ESPC is a very strong tool, and I can vouch for it because I've seen the value of it. But most importantly, when it's done right, you mentioned owner's
Yes.
rep, training, education, which education is a passion of mine. When people can understand how something actually works and then can get involved with making it work, especially from an organizational standpoint, it makes a project that much more successful. And there's so much more, like you said, we could go on, and hopefully we can circle back and cover more topics. I'd love to do another conversation. But as we depart here, what would you say where people can find information, whether it's something that you're doing, and I'll also add some links, but where would you direct people to get more information and connecting with what you're doing?
So through the Energy Services Coalition, which has been a nonprofit organization around for almost 30 years of state energy officials and ESCOs and others to promote the use of performance contracting. I was on the board for many years. Before that, I used to work with Linda Smith, who was one of the creators of it in Colorado. And we created model documents and guidance documents, all this kind of stuff. So I left the board and became a consultant to ESC a few years ago for this U.S. Department of Energy ESPC campaign, right? And through this campaign, we developed 25 different sets of trainings, webinars, workshops. I provided technical assistance for free through this contract to state of California, state of Georgia, individual cities, towns, school districts all over the country. And it really helped people learn a lot about this in a slow, methodical way, right? We took, like, Department of Energy separates performance contracting into 5 phases. So we did a webinar for each phase, and then we did specialty webinars about portions of that, like how to design a really good RFP, how to procure your ESCO the right way, right? How to do commissioning. What does measurement verification really mean? And we brought specialists in, like Efficiency Evaluation Organization, or EVO, puts together the International Performance Measurement and Verification Protocols, which is absolutely the gold standard globally for measurement verification, not just in performance contracting, but for utility demand-side management programs all over the world. This gets used by, like, countries, right, to do their utility management program. So that's a great source of information. U.S. Department of Energy, right now, it's hard to find the right pages because a lot of them have been taken down. U.S. DOE Better Buildings Initiative still has some of the web pages up for learning more about performance contracting. NASEO, National Association of State Energy Officials, naseo.org. Dave Terry, friend of mine, runs that. They still do some work with performance contracting. And of course, NAESCO, the National Association of Energy Services Companies. My old friend Tim Unruh runs that. They also have webinars and this and that. It's mainly, ESCO focused, but they do have a lot of good stuff that they put out there. And, you've got my email address. Anybody has questions, feel free to reach out to me. More than interested in helping.
Well, I will add all this information to the video and the description. Thanks again for this conversation.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it, Marcus.
Thanks for listening to Clear Haze Exchange. New episodes drop every 2 weeks. You can catch Clear Haze Exchange on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, iHeartRadio, and more. Let's clear the haze about sustainability and energy efficiency together. Subscribe now and join the conversation.